From Meta to Scrollmark, Akshay Madhani's journey has been all about engagement at scale. He's worked inside the biggest social platforms on earth, helped shape how we interact online, and now he's building a company that's redefining how brands connect with people. This is a deep one. Let's get into it. So, Akshay, thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Really excited to hear them and really excited to talk to you, Andre.
Thank you. So, very hard not to touch on the subject that before Scrollmark, you were into PayPal, LinkedIn, Meta, Facebook. It's really hard not to ask you, how was that experience working, for instance, for Meta? I would imagine it's like today's biggest communication hub for humanity in a sense. How was that like?
It was amazing. I really can't think of a better place for a young engineer to be. The mentorship I got there, the people I got to work with, it was all really amazing. And, I would say that for me, I think about like the experience of Meta in two ways, right? One is work. The really great thing about Meta is that they allow you to move team to team basically like every year. And I fully took advantage of that, right? I started out on the youth team, which, when I started there, I was pretty young. And, the youth team was all about building products for teenagers ages 13 to 18 who were mostly in English-speaking countries like the US and Canada. And I was not that far removed from like what I felt like I could understand the pain points of people of that age when they use social media. So that team was releasing these experimental products, some of which came out into the wild, some of which did not, over and over again. And that was a really fun experience, very startup-y. At least that's how it felt to me at the time before I started a startup. And then I kind of moved more onto the core business, talking about like comment ranking, pages. And finally, like my last gig before I left the company was on the crypto team, which was also a pretty interesting experience. Then I kind of left to start Scrollmark. So, the really nice thing is that I found great mentorship at each place, but also got to learn a different part of the business and a different way in which Meta is really serving its consumers. From the social side, I will say Meta is like a great place to be. First of all, I remember when we started there, you would actually talk to your employees on your personal Facebook, to your coworkers and to your boss and all that sort of stuff, which really made the job feel a little bit more casual, a little bit more friendly. And ultimately, I think we moved on to a platform called Workplace, which they still use. And then, on top of that, you have this huge campus, these amazing restaurants on campus, like, ice cream store open like literally from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. every day. I gained so much weight when I was at Meta. It was really bad, but also really fun. So
that's awesome.
Yeah.
And if I'm not mistaken, you've led the feature of top fans, right? The development of it. I always got curious. Was that feature out of user like feedback, or was it like more like Meta or Facebook trying to like explore this new area out of like something internal?
Yeah, actually, it's a funny story. I was not initially part of the team that developed Top Fans, right? Top Fans was developed by another team that almost completely through attrition completely got disbanded, right? People left, right, and center, and then they gave me the project in order to deprecate it. They had only launched Top Fans on a specific number of accounts. So you can imagine like, you're launching it on specific celebrities or news accounts. And, I looked at the results of what Top Fans had been able to achieve. And I said, there's no way I should be deprecating this. I should be expanding this beyond what's been done. And, that was obviously not in the directive. I had to kind of struggle internally and kind of make my point, which was a really good learning experience for me. But ultimately, I got the chance to prove myself. They said, hey, you have 3 months to show that if we remove Top Fans, it's going to be a detriment to this team, this company. And I ran this thing called the negative test where, some of the pages that had Top Fans, for half of them, I took it away and I saw how kind of the public reacted, right? There was obviously a numeric drop, right? There was a drop in the amount of engagement that page was getting. But I think what was more interesting was actually the consumers sharing their sentiment online. Like one of the really fun parts about top fans is all the engagements are public. They're happening on public pages. So you can actually go and read them. And there were actually users being like, where did my top fans badge go? I think that was one of the craziest things, one of the great forces to convince my team and my boss that this is something we need to continue to invest in. And we did that. We went from just me working on it to, by the time I left the team, something like 8 or 9 individuals working on this project.
That's awesome. That's awesome. You've got a taste of engagement at the largest scale possible, right? At Facebook.
Right.
Is there any particular thing that you've noticed? I mean, engagement and stuff. You're pretty much dealing with user behavior in a sense, right? Is there any I don't know, anything that caught your attention as to how users are behaving or something in that sense?
Yeah, I think, the really cool thing about Meta is that obviously you're working at a global scale. And there's differences in engagement rates in different localities, but then there's universalities amongst human behaviors around the globe, right? So I'll give you an example, right? The place that like engagement would be like driven the most would always be like India and Southeast Asia, right? Partially because the volume is so much. You're talking about the scale of 2 billion people versus if you're talking about the United States, you're talking about 300 million people, right? So you're talking about 10x the number of people, but also because at that time, like those individuals tended to be more open, expressing themselves on social media. The content was fairly similar across, obviously translated, but the basic content was pretty similar across these different, localities, which I think was really, really interesting. Taught me a lot about kind of psychology and sociology when you consider a global scale.
Makes a lot of sense. We're different, but pretty much all the same at the core, right?
Exactly.
As humans. Actually, the move to Scrollmark, that's a curiosity. So you worked with engagement for a long time there. You probably learned a lot about it. Was the concept of Scrollmark, or previously Dropyashed, right? Was that something that was it more of a slow transition as to you kind of thinking of it, or was it more of like a snap finger realization, like, hey, something needs to be done here?
Yeah, I think it was more of a slow realization, right? As I mentioned, the last team I was on when I was at Meta was the crypto team, right? And I believe what had happened is that Meta had tried to launch their own blockchain and ran into regulatory issues, and a lot of the engineers on that team were leaving essentially in order to either start their own blockchains or to join an existing blockchain company. And by the time I joined, I was like, hey, the attrition is gone, we're starting anew. But I joined, and then like every 2 weeks somebody was leaving. Like engineers were dropping like flies off the team. And quickly I realized that if I was serious about Web3, Meta was probably not the right place to be. So I left the company. I started exploring starting my own company. And ultimately, the journey has been a little bit up and down, right? We've been kind of feeling around in the dark. We explored Web3 and we said, hey, like the right place for us to be, given the team's makeup, given what we know we can accomplish in social, is in social media. And ultimately kind of, started Scrollmark, and have seen pretty good success in helping brands, build connections between their fans and themselves on these social platforms, which have become almost the communication networks, as you mentioned, of the modern day. This is how you talk to your consumers these days. So that's kind of been my journey.
That's awesome. And for you, Akshay, the man, let's say, how was becoming a founder? I mean, you were in a pretty stable company, right? I mean, a pretty stable career if we look at it. And then you took the leap of faith of becoming a founder. How was that like to you personally?
It was interesting. I think, you quickly realize that as a founder, like, when you're at Facebook, you have one boss, right? You have one manager that you report to. And obviously you have, tech leads, other coworkers, you're talking to a ton of people, but ultimately the goal is pretty narrow. Versus when, you're a founder, you have a ton of other people you essentially report to. I think there's a sense that, that the people who work for the company are, they're depending on you and, in my case, my co-founder Nikhil, to drive the direction and make sure that, they're working on something good, that they're happy, but also that we're successful. You're kind of reporting up to the investors who are expecting a lot of you and making sure that, the company is kind of moving in the right direction. Um, but ultimately, I think, there is a saying at Facebook that, like, nothing is anybody else's problem, like, basically saying that you got to take responsibility for everything. But it's really hard to actually implement that in practice when you're at such a large company, and it completely start to really understand it in a small company. So, like, an example of this is that, like, there's this client that we have, Cozy Earth, and they run these insane giveaways which always break our infrastructure. um it's like a data storm test, like, happening live. I remember we used to obviously have like massive company wide outages when I was at Meta. And, the reaction was, all right, like, systems are down. We can't really do anything. Like, write some code if you can, like, locally, and hope that it gets better. Just like keep watching the page, right? Um, you move to, like, a startup, like, you are deeply involved in seeing what's going on, right? Like, why are things down, right? Like, why can't the other clients use the software? Quickly learned that, everything, like, from, like, these things that you don't even think need to be done in a company at Meta are all kind of abstracted away from you. You have to be really hands on with at a startup.
That makes sense. Everything is everyone's problem times 10, right? In a smaller
Right.
company, in a sense. Responsibilities,
Exactly.
man. Yep. Actually, of course, we all know about Scrollmark, but it's always such an interesting opportunity to talk to a CEO of a startup and get like the direct vision. So I'd love to ask you, like, in your vision, what is Scrollmark?
That's a good question. I think Scrollmark is a marketing automation platform for social media, but that's a boring explanation, right? What we're really trying to do is solve the disconnect between how social media should be used and how businesses are trying to use it. Like, we've seen, like, in the last 4 to 5 years, sometimes organic social reporting up to the public relations function rather than the marketing function, which I think is completely backwards. So I think, what are the three goals that like Scrollmark helps you accomplish as a business? One is, how do we get our engagement up, right? The whole point of social is to connect with your community. How do we make sure that your community is listening to you, you're listening to your community, and you're crafting your content to respond to what your community is saying? Number two is conversion, right? The whole point of marketing ultimately is to drive downstream conversion, to drive awareness, and then push people further down the funnel. That the measurement for that is broken in organic social, right? We just say, we kind of measure it based on engagement and stop there, which is partially why organic social doesn't necessarily get the budgets that, paid does. So we're able to essentially mention that. And the third is scaling, right? Like, allowing brands to have the same brand voice and the same social impact as larger brands without necessarily hiring these really expensive agencies or like an army of social media managers, as you see at some of these larger public companies. Those are kind of the three problems that we solve. How do we do it? I think we do it through automation. That kind of brings us back to the first point, which is that we're a marketing automation platform, right? How do we automate responses to your DMs and messages? How do we automate a social club that rewards people for engaging with you consistently? And how do we automate the creation of consistent content, which obviously can never be fully automated, right? You will always need somebody to come in and provide that creativity and inspiration for content. But how do we make that fast so that you're able to release a ton of content on a weekly basis?
That makes sense. And in regards to that automation, I have a question, a bit of a heavy one, but I was thinking, it seems like a lot of brands nowadays, they're kind of getting lost in this like coldness in a sense, kind of like they lose their personality in a sense. And I'm not sure if that has to do with this attempt to like mass communicate, but like the same thing. How do you guys handle this balance between automation and let's say human connection for a brand?
I actually somewhat disagree with you. I don't think that brands are essentially kind of losing their voice. I think we're just noticing it more, right? Like brands have learned that, reaching consumers is really hard and building awareness is really hard. So, they're investing more in blasting their brand out into obviously ads and, social and PR and billboards, like out of home, like all that sort of stuff, right? And when that brand has kind of a boring message, you're much more likely to notice it because you're seeing it every day. I think there's been creative brands, there's been boring brands for like the last 100 years, right? We just have higher expectations now, and we're much more visibly seeing their advertising now. But kind of coming back to your other side of the question, which is how do we balance human connection and automation? I think we, as obviously consumers in the technology age, actually do appreciate when some kind of interactions are automated, right? If I go to a specific piece of software, like I want to use everything self-serve as much as possible before having to call up a human, because I know that like if I try to call up somebody, it's going to take them like 15 minutes, maybe like 2 hours to come to the phone. So one is transparency. Be transparent about what kind of interactions are being automated, right? And the second is knowing when to hand off to a person, right? Like obviously at some point, if we're like 3 levels deep into a conversation and we're detecting that we haven't solved that person's problem yet, it's time to kick it out to a real person who's going to be able to solve that problem. I actually think that a lot of consumers appreciate a level of automation early so that they can get to what they need quickly. I think where they don't appreciate automation is that they have a very complex request and they just have no way to like get in touch with a real person.
That's amazing. In a sense, what I take of what you said is that most of the times we get tired of an automation is when it doesn't work, right? So it's not because it is automation, it's because it's bad automation. So having like I love as a user when I can just get my things solved, interacting with the system, that's it. No need to go and talk to a human or have to share data. Just questions, I get responses, I get actions taken. That's what I want. So that is a pretty cool insight. So actually, you guys cover several different types of clients right now, different brands, right? From cosmetics to motorcycling, video games. Actually, I've known Crazy Games. I have used that site before. And it was awesome when I checked and I saw, hey, they're clients of yours. That's cool. How do you deal with like such diverse clients, right? That's completely different use cases.
Yeah, I think part of that comes from a strong customer success motion, right? Obviously, a lot of their needs are the same because we're dealing with social media managers at every client that we work with. They all want to see an increase in engagement. They all want to prove that engagement is driving actual monetary value to the brand. But ultimately, their brand voice is going to be different. The things that they want their customers to accomplish is going to be different. And, we kind of work to build the initial set of automations for each brand after having a conversation about what their goals are, how their customers are currently interacting with them on other channels in order to make sure that they have a good early experience, which ultimately, motivates every person we work with to learn the platform themselves and start to build their own automations, right? So, this is a new channel for a lot of people, and learning how to kind of do this right, we have to make sure we invest in that so that these customers are happy in the long term.
Mm-hmm. And what about global? We're certainly at a global level, right? Market now.
Right.
And how widespread is Scrollmark at the moment? Are you guys operating mostly in the US, Europe? What's the...
We have clients all over the world, right? We have, I think, 1 or 2 in Europe. We have 1 or 2 in Canada as well, mostly sleep brands. I think we were working with the largest like mattress seller in Canada. And now we have 2 brands in India that we're working with as well. But ultimately, most of our clients, we're still young, we're still small. I think most of our clients are still here in the US. And part of that is intentional, right? Ad spend and marketing don't necessarily always go hand in hand, but they have a level of correlation. And something like 40% of the world's ad spend is still in the United States, which tells you how big of a market this is. So if you can succeed here in terms of marketing, you can succeed anywhere, and that's kind of the route that we've taken.
That makes a lot of sense. Wow, that's big metrics. 40%. Whew. So actually, what's one particular brand or a specific type of market that you thought was a very interesting use case for Scrollmark? Was there a particular one where you said, "Wow, that's different. That's exotic"? I don't know.
I have seen a few. I'll talk about a few. So one was obviously crazy games, right? Most of our clients use us for Instagram. But crazy games was a really fun one because, they didn't even connect their Instagram to Scrollmark. They only used us for TikTok. We currently cannot send messages on TikTok. We can only do comment response. But, crazy games obviously targets these, younger demographic of people who play games online, and they were getting a ton of comments, and a lot of their comments looked very similar, right? So we said, all right, we can't automate away comment response to all of your comments, but for the 10 or 15 that continue to be repeated, which make up something like 40% of all of your comments, we'll take care of that, right? And they were super happy. They kind of set it up once and never touched it again, and allowed them to focus a lot more on content creation, which is driving that brand awareness and driving those kind of website visits that they want to see from these gamers. Another one is Cozy Earth. Man, they've broken our system so many times because they do these insane giveaways. Like, we're talking about like $20,000, $30,000 of merch they're giving away, almost on a monthly basis. And every time they do it, they get like a slew of new followers. They get something like 10,000 comments. It's insane. It's insane. That honestly taught me a lot about social strategy because, you can spend a ton on ads to grow your socials. But if you just do giveaways, just like over and over and over and over again, and those giveaways are actually worth a lot, people will go crazy for them, right? Everyone loves free stuff, right? So they've been able to kind of grow their socials in a really, really healthy way just by leveraging these giveaways over and over and over again.
That's awesome. I checked the your Fox Racing campaign. You got 1,200 opt-in emails in 3 days. That is an insane number. And how was that? Like, how did that work?
I think just like any other marketing campaign, the automation is obviously a huge part of it, right? Where Scrollmark comes in is the ability for us to, as soon as somebody engages with you, reach out over DMs and, collect the email in a way that, respects the brand's kind of privacy guidelines and make sure the user is aware that they know what their email is being used for, which previously on social was pretty hard to execute. But ultimately, part of it is just the creativity and the authenticity of the campaign, right? Fox ran this campaign with a motorcyclist who was really, really, really popular in the space, Joe Shimoda. And Joe had a genuine connection with that Fox audience. And that authenticity was the reason that people wanted to comment and ultimately give their emails.
Makes sense. Talking a bit about, one thing I've learned actually while talking to founders as well is that, of course, we always like to look at the successes and, of course, learn from them. But it seems that every founder has like a war story, as I call it, right? Which is times when things didn't quite work out the way they were supposed to. Do you have a war story? Were there times where just things didn't work out, and any lessons you can share about that?
Oh man, we have so many war stories, right? And they come from like every single part of the business, right? We talk about when we started this company, we were pursuing, marketing in Web3, which was a market that died on us so quickly because as soon as we started, FTX collapsed, and suddenly all these major brands who are interested in like marketing in the Web3 world were like, you know what, we're gonna wait off for a little bit and see how this goes, right? And some of them came back eventually, a lot of them just never did. We have war stories with the way our platform was built. I remember we finally like won this big customer, and we had a bug in the way that kind of login was working, and we get on this onboarding call and we ask them to make an account and they just can't make an account, and suddenly the onboarding ends, right? It just, I think was learned from that experience that when you spend time trying to QA, trying to make sure that the platform works, you always want to like check the flows that somebody is going to like touch in the first 5 to 10 minutes first. Like those need to work in a pristine manner, because if you lose them in the first 5 to 10 minutes, you're never getting them back. That was like our first customer. I felt so bummed. I think anytime you do automations, as you mentioned, like customers appreciate it when automations go as planned. They do not appreciate it when automations don't go as planned. And you're dealing with computers, right? Sometimes the automation will just not go as planned. An example is that like we had set up like FAQs for a specific customer. The audience for this specific customer used a ton of abbreviations, and we weren't trained to kind of deal with abbreviations. We were sending the wrong response, and that kind of taught me that, hey, like real users do not behave in ideal ways. Something that obviously intuitively, and something that I've dealt with before in my career at Facebook, right? But it was just interesting to like see that, hey, like we hadn't accounted for this, and we had to account for that. And since then, we've kind of been testing our automations on the previous engagements that a specific customer's audience has left to make sure that we would deal with it in an appropriate way.
There's a parallel to that experience on the onboarding. Of course, here at Esfera, as a UX design studio, we do a lot of initial pages, logins, signups, onboarding, and it's always a bit of a paradox, actually, which I'm sure you have faced before. I know you guys involve a lot of UX in your products. I'm actually thinking of asking you a little bit about that later, but just commenting is that so onboardings like logins and signups, they generally look pretty much the same, right? Because it's that kind of a flow where there's not a lot of room for inventing stuff, like for reinventing the wheel. You just have to make sure that it works exactly as users are intending, right? And that's a constant in UX. Where do we reinvent things, and when or where do we just go with what works, right? That's a custom we have. But talking a bit about UX, actually, we know you guys are quite involved in user experience in your product. How do you view user experience for your users in a sense?
Yeah, I think my co-founder Nikhil, who's our CTO, he has this principle he likes to follow called espresso machine engineering. And the way that works is that if you think about an espresso machine, there's a ton of dials and knobs, and if you're an expert, you can kind of go in and really craft the perfect cup of espresso for you. But if you're a novice like me, you can just go press a button and coffee comes out, and that's all you do, right? So what we try to like implement is the same thing in our platform, right? We have like easy mode on our platform, where if you're new to automation, we're very prescriptive with what you do, and we tell you exactly what you're doing and why you're doing it, as almost an educational experience. But if you really want to get involved in the platform, we have the advanced capabilities to customize as much as you possibly can. And I will say most users take the simple route, right? They just kind of build something. If they need to do anything advanced, they come to us, have customer success do it. But then we do have some clients who are really power users and end up becoming our advocates, right? Who use every single feature that we release. I think that's really important, right? Making it easy for everyone, but for the power users who really love your platform and who want to advocate for you if they see that this is really cool, you give them every sort of power in the world.
Makes sense. Actually, you guys, in my vision, you guys are working with two layers of user experience in a sense. You have user experience, or you have UX for your direct clients, but then actually what you're doing is creating experiences as well for their clients, right? So you're working on two levels there. What's your vision on that?
Yeah, it's very B2B2C. It's interesting. I think we always kind of try to focus the most on the consumer experience, because the client experience is something that we can actually control very heavily ourselves, right? In the sense that we can kind of use customer success to help you make sure that you're getting the right experience, right? But ultimately, the consumer experience is important because, number one, we can't work with each consumer, right? Like you're talking about, if you look at all of our clients, like hundreds of thousands of consumers. The second reason is because ultimately the client's going to be happy if their consumers are happy, right? Nothing else really matters. So it is kind of an interesting dynamic. Especially because we're using these messaging systems that clients feel like they can kind of say anything to and it will figure it out. But oftentimes it doesn't, right? Like people are used to this chat GPT era where you look at a chat box, you can kind of type everything in and bing, bang, boom, everything kind of comes out. We're not built that way, right? We obviously can kind of account for some of the things that the client says and point them in the right direction. But ultimately, for a brand safety perspective, we don't want to just kind of throw LLM responses at everything. So, as I mentioned, at those times, you have to kick it out to a human on the team, on the brand's team, in order to kind of manage the conversation that's starting to occur. But yeah, it is definitely it's an interesting experience to help our clients craft experiences that they believe their consumers would enjoy, and also almost advising them, right? Part of this is an advisory role on, hey, like we've worked with consumers building these DM experiences for a long time. Here's what works, here's what doesn't.
So you do kind of like integrate a little bit of marketing advice as well to the brands? Is that?
Oh, of course, not even a little bit, a lot. That's like a huge part of what we do.
Well, that's awesome. I mean, it makes sense. You're involved in the entirety of it, right? And a little bit about AI, actually. What's the current level of AI usage, let's say, in your product? And what's your vision on the future for how much you guys plan to use it if the technology continues, right, to expand and improve?
Right. I think, as you mentioned, because we're a B2B2C company, there's AI being used in two separate ways, right? One is how the brands use AI to interact with and respond to their customers. There's plenty of AI there. A lot of it is actually more traditional kind of call and response, like segmenter type AI, to allow the brand to have maximum control over what's actually going out and not kind of letting a chatbot run wild. Ultimately, I think where we have a lot of freedom as a platform is how we can build AI into our own platform to allow the client to achieve what they want to achieve using a healthy dose of AI. And we continue to invest more and more in that. We have, for example, recently released an AI journey builder where rather than kind of coming and building out each piece of the journey, which is, hey, when somebody comments this, send them this message and then ask for their email, and building it out in like a visual flow builder the way you would do, you can actually just type into an AI what you want a journey to do, and we'll build a journey for you. And we're investing in more and more different kind of experiences for these marketers that we work with to interact with AI to quickly get to the solution that they need to get to and accomplish what they need to accomplish while they're on Scrollmark.
Makes sense. Actually, what would you say is the biggest challenge that you guys are facing now with technology, in a sense?
That's a good question. Ultimately, I think, the biggest challenge with technology is always kind of unintended usage, right? Building something like quickly is never that difficult. There's always the last 10 to 20% that takes the most time. Like, how do we kind of account for a client who may not have the same level of experience with flow building or with visual journey experiences, and how do we make it easy for them to build a Scrollmark journey and get value out of Scrollmark? That's on the UX side, right? Oftentimes, the client does something they're not, intended to do, and it may break the platform. So how do you put guardrails around client usage and educate them on what's possible and what's just not possible, right? Or what maybe just doesn't make any sense. This is more on kind of the engineering bug side, but also a little bit on the UX side, right? These are really difficult things to accomplish, right? Especially when you've built such a kind of comprehensive platform as we have, right? People will try to use every part that's available to them. And we have a bug report channel where we're just kind of we're using Hotjar and trying to see client usage to try to understand where our UX could be better, but also where the clients have tried something and it literally just failed, and being like, all right, first of all, let's reach out to that client and be tell them what went wrong. And second of all, let's see how we can fix this, right? So that consumes more and more and more of our engineering team's time. First of all, as we build more stuff, right? The more stuff there is, the more surface area you have to maintain. And second of all, as we get more clients, the more clients they are, the more they're going to use it, the more that's going to break, right? So that client growth that we've seen in the last 6 months has been huge, and like stress testing our platform to a level we haven't seen before.
Yep. So growth is, of course, a blessing, but it brings some challenges with it, right?
Of course.
Especially when you're dealing with like so much granularity, like how many clients combined, or how many users combined, consumers combined, do all the brands have? I'd say hundreds of thousands, right? That
Exactly.
is pretty interesting. And actually, what's next for Scrollmark in a sense? Like, where would you say you guys are headed? What's your vision for the next like couple years or so?
Yeah, I think what we're starting to realize is that social marketers aren't necessarily happy with the tools that they have today. So right now we focused on one slice of technology to serve social marketers, right? DM and comment response and automation building, right? But this is actually not the core of what most social marketers are involved in. Most of it is content creation, right? A lot of it is analytics, right? Like how do we, after we create content, analyze how it did and make sure we do better next time, or if it did really well, make sure we repeat that. We want to kind of get involved in that process and really become a one-stop shop for social marketers to accomplish the goals that they need to accomplish. That's kind of the next evolution of Scrollmark that you're going to be seeing in 2025.
That is awesome. I'm starting to handle some side projects where I am doing a lot of social media stuff. And man, do I have to say, it is complicated. There's not enough good solutions, right, at the moment that are covering everything. So just having a look at your current success and knowing that you guys are moving in to try and fill that gap, that is amazing. Actually, I'm definitely going to be on the lookout for Scrollmark, as we are definitely needing you guys right now. Actually, we've kind of touched the subject of AI a little bit. It is a subject that it's very hard not to talk about lately, and I've been seeing so many interesting opinions around it. What is yours? What do you think of AI? What do you think the future is? What do you think AI is going to be? What impact would it have in your market? What's your idea of it in general?
I think AI is already starting to have a huge impact on social media, right? We're seeing a lot of AI generated content come out, right, on platforms like TikTok and Instagram. And some of it is really good. And most of those are made with quite a heavy dose of human touch. Some of it is really bad. And that's kind of when you're just kind of pumping out content with no regards for quality. And ultimately, some of it is just kind of content as usual, right? Like, to be fair, a lot of businesses don't necessarily produce the best content for social media. Like oftentimes, if you don't have a social media manager, or even if you do, and they don't really know how to, create content that engages people well, you're just kind of releasing content for the sake of it. So for those businesses, if you replace it with AI content, it doesn't really make a huge difference. I think an area in which I believe AI is going to have a huge impact is also in the way that algorithms do ranking, right? That is really like ranking and recommender systems are really the original form of AI, right? And we may not have necessarily seen the same breakthroughs in the last 5 years for those AI systems. There's still been a lot of advancements, and there's really innovative ways in which like GPT models can be used to essentially inform like platforms like Meta and TikTok about content, and about like how this content like should be shown to the right people. And we are seeing kind of the rise of unconnected content through platforms like TikTok and Instagram Reels. Like if you think about the evolution of social media, right? You started with social media really being social. Like what you saw on social media 15 years ago was your grandma's like cat pics, right? Like that was really like, that's what you were looking at. And then eventually somebody came along and said, hey, like that may be interesting to you. But you know what's just like more interesting to you? Like good content created by people who do this semi-professionally or even professionally, right? And now these platforms are like replacing TV, right? They're replacing not social, but media, right? But what that means is that the algorithms that recommend you a specific piece of content have to be really, really, really good for you to stay on and feel entertained. So yeah, that's kind of my view on how AI is impacting both on the creator side, but also ultimately on the platform side.
That is a very, very cool insight. That makes sense. We're so focused on LLMs lately that, in a sense, it feels like the algorithms for recommendation haven't really evolved in a couple of years, right?
That's
That
not true.
is,
They have.
and
They totally have. Like
they have.
that's just not true. It's just not as sexy, so people don't notice it, right? But there's been huge breakthroughs.
Would you say that we're getting better at detecting then, like what people want, in a sense?
Oh yeah, 100%. Um, we're getting better at understanding what a piece of content like represents, right? When we understand that, it's easier to first of all understand why did a specific user like linger on a specific piece of content when they were watching through their feed, or like why did they watch it all the way through, like what about that content was interesting to them, and then find similar pieces of content to recommend that user.
That is also a cool insight. So it made sense that the technology that you've mentioned, it is advancing, but it's incredible the fact that since it's not sexy, sometimes it's easy to miss, right? So I kind of wanted to poke around on that actually, like what else can we be missing, right? Technology wise, that is already having an impact on our lives. I know it's a tough question. It's almost like asking you like, hey, what are the secrets of technology in a sense right now?
I think it's an interesting question. What's really interesting is that we're seeing kind of, I think one of the areas where I'm like watching, which obviously is not really having an impact yet, but may in 10, 20 years have a huge impact on the way that technology, that we interact with technology, is quantum computing, right? Like we're starting to kind of reach the limits of Moore's law, right? Moore's law being like, hey, like every 24 months you can essentially like fit double the number of transistors on a chip, and the more transistors you can fit, the more you're going to be able to compute large pieces of software, right? Like this is a huge reason that LMs have been unlocked, that our hardware is so good that we can kind of work with LLMs, right? I think quantum computing is going to represent a huge leap forward, at least for certain problems that we want to solve. Obviously, it won't be applicable for everything, but this is especially important as we start to reach the limits of Moore's laws. We're like literally reaching the limits of physics of how small we can make things. So that I think is going to be interesting. One of the things that I have noticed is that a lot of the large companies have started to hire hardware teams to make hardware that's very specialized for their workloads, right? So for example, like Google and Facebook, they have obviously their own data centers, and then in these data centers, because of the specific products that they have in YouTube and Google and this and that, like they have very specific workflows, right? So how can we craft hardware that's optimized to these specific workflows, rather than depending on the fact that every 2 years hardware is just going to get more efficient and we shouldn't be investing in that? So that kind of is an interesting tidbit that I've kind of seen in terms of how the current hiring of these companies is telling us something about how they see hardware today.
Have you look at your career, Akshay? You've worked with several tech giants. Then you went and completely flipped over the idea of starting your own company. Is there a thread in your experiences throughout all of these companies that you think is a constant, like something that hasn't changed, something that a common thread amongst the different experiences that you had?
Yeah, I think one thing that, it doesn't matter what industry you work with and it doesn't matter what kind of company it is, one of the most important things is people, right? Like ultimately you have to work with other people. In order to do so effectively, you have to understand what their motivations are. You have to align your motivations with their motivations, and you have to kind of work with them, show that you appreciate and recognize their contributions, make your own contributions very visible and heard. Like, and this is a skill, right? Like, this is not something that you're necessarily taught when you're young, right? And it's, I think, really important, no matter whether you are kind of just starting out in your career, whether you're a manager, whether you're leading a team, whether you're even working as like a consultant or contractor. I think this is one of the most important things, right? Working well with people, making sure that you're helping them accomplish what they need to accomplish, and they in turn are helping you accomplish what you need to accomplish. So I think, I'm sure that's going to be a thing that's something that I've learned. I like started to pick up at Facebook. I've kind of continued down that journey of learning how to do this well at Scrollmark. I'm sure wherever I go next, is going to be part of the learning experience there.
It is an infinite learning experience, right? What's one thing you would say is a very common mistake, perhaps, that founders, or a common misconception that founders have?
Well, I think, this is kind of cliche. People talk about it all the time. But like, when I was kind of early in my founders kind of journey, we thought a lot about, hey, like, technology more than we thought about how do we go to market. And we were like, hey, like, we're gonna like guard our idea in case like nobody steals it, right? Like, this was obviously very early on, and very quickly I learned that, hey, like ideas, most ideas, sometimes they are, but most ideas are not worth anything, right? Technology is worth something, but only if you know how to bring it to market, right? Like, you got to start with first understanding what the pain points are of a specific customer segment, and crafting technology to answer those pain points in an effective way, rather than kind of going the other way around, which is, building technology off of your beliefs on how a problem could be solved and then bringing it to customers. Since then, we've kind of taken the ethos of launch early and often and get feedback, because, hey, like, your clients are going to tell you what they like and they don't like, right, about your product. And, if they don't like something, they're going to tell you, right? And that's going to be valuable in making sure that you spend your valuable cycles building the right thing.
That's funny. I have a client that always uses the fail fast approach. So that's a common thing that I hear a lot is, get out there, try, fail fast, learn from it, and go again. Actually, one thing that you've mentioned as being a founder is that everything kind of becomes everyone's problem, right? In a startup. One thing I've also noticed from other conversations is that founders, many times they have to do different things at a specific company. As I like to call it, wear multiple hats. You're sometimes a marketer, sometimes a developer, a designer. Is there, apart from being a CEO, of course, is there a specific function or a specific hat that you feel comfortable or very comfortable using apart from CEO?
The CEO, I would say, is not really a hat. Like, sometimes it can be, obviously, but, I think I have to be comfortable now wearing all the hats, right? Sometimes, I have to be involved in marketing functions. Sometimes I have to be involved in sales functions. Sometimes I have to be involved in like product design and product management functions, right? So I've worn all these hats. Some of these took longer to learn than others, coming from an engineering background. Like, obviously, working with product maybe felt a little bit more natural to me early on. Sales, I had to pick up, right? Marketing, I had to pick up. I think right now I'm spending a lot of time trying to figure out how I can wear the marketing hat more effectively, right? That's something that we as a company want to continue to invest in. So, and it's something that I think would help me build empathy with the people that I actually talk to as customers, right? Like, having done a level of marketing myself will help me talk to marketers better. So that's kind of where my focus is right now, and the hat I'm trying to wear the most.
Makes sense. You seem to be surrounded by a lot of intelligent people in your entire career, I'd say, and now at Scrollmark. I'd like to ask you, what's one good piece of advice that you heard along your long career there?
Yeah, I think one really good piece of advice I got was, I got this from like a leader at Facebook who said that, hey, like, build for real human behavior and not ideal human behavior. And actually, like an experience I had that typifies this really well is, recently I was helping my grandfather remotely set up his iPad, right? And I was like on FaceTime on his phone, like while he was pointing the camera. Like, first of all, he didn't know how to turn the camera towards his iPad, and his YouTube wouldn't update, and it took me like something that would have taken me maybe 30 seconds took him essentially like 2 hours to figure out. When you work with like a global population at like a large tech company, these are the users that you have, and these are the challenges that you're going to deal with, right? You're going to have to work through the constraints, not of technology, but of how your users interact with that technology. Now at Scrollmark, I think that challenge, as you mentioned, we're both a consumer company and like, a company that serves marketers, right? And, the challenges may look a little bit different. I think having worked with marketers, I can see that there's like a range of their comfort level with technology. There's some marketers who, kind of go in and, they understand technology inside out. There's some marketers who, struggle a little bit more, right? With consumers, the range is much, much more wider, right? So we've got to experience kind of what that looks like, real and ideal human behavior on two different fronts. And, we try to do our best. Sometimes we do make mistakes, but I think we've learned from those mistakes as to like how we can best serve these marketers and also the consumers that they serve in order to make sure they're like delivering really crisp experiences that are easy to go through.
Actually, what's a common mistake that you're seeing brands make outside, of course, of the Scrollmark sphere where you have advice and control over it? What do you see out in the wild that make you go, that could be better done or something?
I think I hear a lot from a lot of brands that, hey, like, we want to be more like Duolingo, right? Which is like, they don't spend a lot on ads. Their entire marketing department is basically organic social. In order to do that, you have to take like risks with your brand, right? The reason that Duolingo works is that if you watch the account, it's somewhat unhinged. Like they offend people, they piss off people, and that's okay. Like that gets people talking. Right. When you have a social presence that's very curated, you treat your social similar to how you would treat like a TV buy, like, and have like similar media in both places. You're not going to get what you need out of social media. Obviously, as somebody in social media, I can tell you more about the mistakes that brands are making in social media than I can about, the mistakes they make in other places. But at least on social media, that's what I see as a mistake that brands make.
I know it's a very cliche phrase, but I'd like to get your piece on it about the phrase of there's no good or bad propaganda. There's just propaganda. Is that right? Not it?
Yeah, there's no good or bad publicity. There's just publicity. I don't know if that's necessarily true. I think there is good or bad publicity, right? At the same time, like you cannot essentially play it safe because you're shying away from bad publicity, right? You have to, give the people you hired in social the leeway to do what they need to do in order to get your brand out there. Because, here's another cliche. If you're not growing, you're dying, right? And growing takes risks, right? Like you have to take risks in order to grow. So that's kind of the way I see it.
That's awesome. One thing I would love to ask you is what's your current setup in Scrollmark? Are you guys doing hybrid, home office? Are you all close? How's that like?
Yeah, I think we have a hybrid setup because we have a few employees based here in the Bay Area, and we go in maybe not every day, but very often. But then we have a pretty large international distributed team. We're able to essentially work with them, at different hours essentially in order to make it work. One of the things that I've kind of seen with this setup is that I think it works when the company is really small, right? Like because, we as founders are willing to like stay up late, maybe wake up early to have conversations with people who may not be in the same time zone as us. And we're able to kind of watch the work that they're releasing pretty closely and, provide our input and all that sort of stuff while the company is small. It's easy to build a good company in a way that's still remote and distributed. But I do believe that as companies start to scale, in-person work is more important, right? So eventually, I think in the next, few years, we definitely do want to establish more of a strong in-office culture. That's something that we're looking to do that helps, first of all, onboard people pretty quickly, right? Like a lot of the people that we have who are remote have been with the company for a long time, have seen it grow from like they know the entire history intuitively, right? If you're coming into like a running car, right? You may not know how that car works. And by being around people who do know how that car works in person every day, you're going to pick it up a lot more quickly. And second of all, in order to make sure that we each kind of understand responsibilities and make sure that they're getting done, right? It's easier to have that intuitive understanding when the company is small, but when the company is no longer as small, I think it's important to maybe have more people in office to see that kind of go smoothly.
Interesting view. Actually, almost forgot to ask, but very curious. How did you found it in a sense of, did you found it alone? Did you have co-founders? Where did you meet?
Yeah. When I left Facebook, I knew I was likely leaving to start a company. So, I started Scrollmark. At the time, I was alone, and very quickly, I started talking to people who I thought would be great people for me to work with. Right. I think the first person I went to was Nikhil, who is currently my co-founder and CTO. I think for a while, I worked on this company mostly kind of alone while I was out of a job, while my at that time co-founders still were in the jobs that they were in before Scrollmark started. And as soon as Scrollmark got funding, my other co-founders kind of left their jobs and we went ahead and launched.
Was there any moment when you were kind of putting that initial effort into it where you thought it was like, come on, maybe it's not going to work? Were there like second guesses in a sense?
There's still those second guesses, right? Like, we're doing pretty well, but I don't think it's far from being able to say that, hey, like we worked and we were able to accomplish what we wanted to accomplish, right? 9 out of every 10 startups fails, right? It's really, really, really hard to build a really successful startup. But I think one of the things that I've kind of learned is that obviously I'm trying really hard to make the startup succeed. So don't take that away. But what I've learned is that even if the startup doesn't do as well as we would hope, the startups can still be a vehicle for personal success, right? Oftentimes I've seen this amongst a lot of startup founders that they fail upwards, right? When they start their second startup, they kind of know intuitively what to do from the start in a way that they didn't in their first startup. And even if they don't start another company, even if they go back to a large company, they're able to, because they have a better understanding of how companies work in general, they're able to impact the growth of that company in a much more significant way, be really successful at their jobs. I definitely see this as like Scrollmark as, hey, like even what we've accomplished in the last 2-ish years has been really, really, really cool. I've learned a lot in terms of if I were to start another company or if I were to go work for a company after this, how I would be able to drive a lot more impact than I would be if I had kind of just stayed at Facebook or gone to another job 2 years ago. I'm shooting for the moon here. I think we can be really the next evolution of how social marketers are able to reach their consumers. And we're starting to see the early embers of that. And, we're going to continue to push that.
That's amazing, man. Please do. We really need to cover that gap with the social media management and engagement. Yeah. Actually, got a last good one for you here. If you were able to go back in time to that moment where you were thinking of starting or founding Scrollmark, what would you say to yourself? Like, what would you, I won't say do differently, but what would you tell yourself?
Oh, I would say talk to more customers, right? I talk to a ton of customers, but I would say talk to even more, right? Show them like actual mocks and designs and like get their thoughts on it, right? Like get really into the weeds with them on like what like you want to accomplish and ask them, spend more time in discovery, right? Like rather than kind of launching directly into what you want to accomplish, actually talk more about what are their pain points, right? What do they care about most of all? Because if you start to get an understanding of that, it's going to completely change the game in terms of like the products that you can build, how fast you can build them, and how relevant they are the second that they come out.
That makes a lot of sense. Akshay, Madhani, thank you very much for joining us today here. A lot of good knowledge. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andre.